think you've got to give yourself the opportunity to stop, even just for 2 minutes, and think about the next time we do this, how are we going to change the way that we scope it? Because the second that you're into that scoping, you're operating on heuristics, and you're doing it the same way that you've done before, you're only going to get the same problems before. You've got to fix the leak before you wash your next batch of clothes. All about the metaphors.
Hello and welcome to the UX Usability Podcast. I am Dr. Chris Parker, and tonight we're talking about consumer experience, we're talking about services, and we're talking about just being advocate for the passion that we have as humans. I'm joined tonight by Karl Randay, the head of design at 383. Now, Karl is a product designer and human-centered design advocate. As said, he's the head of design and consumer experience at Studio 383. Now, he's been working for over 20 years in the leisure industry, in healthcare, in energy service, all the time looking at crafting the way people feel and how they work to make a real difference to their lives. And this is really why we go into UX design, what makes us excited. So I am thrilled to bring to you the discussion which we had together. And I know that you're going to get a lot out of this as someone who cares passionately about UX design.
Well, as with all things, it was a long time ago now. I think it was probably about 14, 15 years old. And 383 started very much as an opportunity for the founders to make a difference with design. Really, there was a lot of kind of cool stuff happening. Not very many notable studios and agencies in Birmingham, and it's almost like a point where some of the old guard were beginning to kind of close down and move away. And Suki and John, who set it up, who I knew at the time, and were really interested in what they could do and how they could change the design scene and kind of grow a bit more of a community, especially in the West Midlands. There's a lot of old players around who play their cards close to the chest. So, the guys saw it as a great chance to try and do a little bit more, both for the design community, but also give themselves an opportunity to prove, what they could do as a two-man team. I didn't join until oh God, how many years now? Five years later or so. Very much as a traditional bit of everything team back in the days when web design and digital gurus were a job description. Doing a lot of branding work and some great early wins for the business. And it just sort of grew from there. And I think the thing that I've always really enjoyed about the business is that over time it takes a deep look at itself and manages to pivot based upon the comfort levels that we have with the work that we're doing, where we see the market going, but also what we see everybody else doing. It's grown and changed considerably over the years it's been alive.
So what do you feel has been the biggest impact you've made?
That I've made personally? Oh my goodness. It's when I guess when I joined the business was probably at its biggest turning point, when we took it from being something that was very traditionally marketing led and kind of classic design studio to being much more product focused. I'd spent 4.5 years working in the digital team at an advertising business and become a little bit disillusioned by lack of insights and having to be very reactive with design. And chatting to Suki and John, the view was that there was a better way of doing it, that we saw a lot of clients who'd been burned by businesses that had gone in and they'd spent 6 months doing research and they dropped a great big weighty tome on the desk of the stakeholders and there was very little for them to action. So we thought, this is a great opportunity to figure out how we can take research and kind of qualitative insights and use that along with a lot of different product theory and methodologies and sort of tear out the pages that we don't think are very practical and try and piece something together that is relatively agile, is quite quick and nimble, can get us to actionable insights really, really quickly. For us, we really enjoy doing the work and figuring out what those solutions look like, but we also really like digging under the surface and understanding both from the stakeholders' perspective, but also their audiences, what they really need, and having almost difficult conversations with clients. Say, right, well, we know you want this, but actually we think this is a better benefit, but not taking forever to do it. I think being quite lean about it is I think like an important point. So I jumped ship from where I was previously onto 383 and spent the first year and a half of my life at the business not doing any design work, and it was just pure strategy. If you rewound 10 years previously and told me I'd be involved in a dedicated research role and doing strategy work, I'd have probably laughed at you. But here I was, sat in front of a like a tiny Mac, kind of wondering where my 28-inch display had gone, thinking, how do I do research? And having to almost start from scratch. And we sort of figured it out as we went. And it was interesting, kind of pioneering days, and we've never looked back. But it was, so much fun.
Oh, yeah. I remember my days when I was a quote unquote real designer, and we were trying to make a simulation of this airport we were designing. So we got 3 monitors, which at the time were huge. I don't know what mentioned, maybe 28-inch in like this arc. Actually, we got a 4th one at the top, so we could put our head in and look around the days before virtual reality. So nice to remember that thought. But I want to go back to something you just said about tearing apart ways of working and making new forms. I'm paraphrasing a bit there.
Yeah.
Now, when you go to university and say design, there's this design thinking Bible of this is the way that you do it. What kind of approaches that were you taking that was a bit different?
So just to unpack that a little bit, I mean, when I went to, this is, I shudder to think how long ago I was at university. I studied traditional typography at university, so the maths of type and reading the page and all the rest of it. So we didn't get that. We were very much kind of thrown into industry and expected to design kind of book jackets and magazines and stuff. And, here we were thinking, actually, the internet was really new. There's a good opportunity to do stuff with this and help, like the new frontier. But in terms of an approach, like I said, when I joined 383, I'd never really been involved in dedicated research or methodologies like this, but because of my previous role in advertising and the frustrations that had grown around this lack of catering for the human side of things and those sort of behavioral needs, I'd got this kind of strong hunch that the way that people are physically with each other and the way that they interact and talk and consume content, could be simplified massively, but there were lots of sort of intrinsic, all that thing that we've come to learn as System 1 and System 2 thinking, played a big part of it. But I didn't really understand any of this, and it was like in the early days, it was a case of trying to figure out, well, how do we join very simple dots together and figure out, well, if we're going into the world where we're trying to understand what people want to do by consuming a service or a product, like let's do that, right? So what jobs are they trying to do? And then it was very much what's in the way, what are the big barriers to do that, but also what do their outcomes look like? And it was like almost creating this little stepping stone pattern. And I think one of the big aha moments for us was when Jeff Goathelf published his first edition of Lean UX. He did a load of workshops around the world, and I was lucky enough to attend the one in London. I goodness know how long ago was this now? This was probably about 6 or 7 years ago, and that was incredible because he kind of opened my eyes to the fact that like research and understanding how to think about designing for real people and all their myriad of kind of different demographic problems and needs and stuff didn't have to be complicated. You don't need you don't actually need a PhD to do it. It's just a case of sit down and listen to them and think about, well, what are they trying to do, and like what's stopping them from doing that, and then doing the same sort of thing with the business as well, marrying it with the same kind of research at the service side, and then from there we just became more aware of some of the other things that people were writing about. So jobs to be done and agile came to the front, and we started reading all these books which like deeply fascinated us. But then we still found ourselves skimming the surface of them quite considerably. So Sprint came out, the kind of the great work those guys kind of did with Google Ventures. And again, we saw like a lot of sense in these methodologies because they're really swift and they're super agile. But then I found myself sat in a workshop, getting people to put sticky notes on the picture of a boat, questioning really how practical is this? So we started kind of going, well, hang on a minute. There's a cleaner way of doing this. And it's probably quicker by cutting out a lot of the stuff in there that isn't practically useful to us. So, while we talk about jobs to be done, there's a lot in there that we think is amazing, but it's so deep that if we followed the classical approach, it would take us like a lot longer and potentially introduce tangents into our process. So we very quickly tried to figure out, well, what all the different pots and the different aspects of these different methodologies that really help us, that we can then begin to evolve and change, because we're all different in terms of studios, and what works for one studio doesn't work for another. So for us, it was figuring out, well, what worked for 383? How do we do this so we can put our own stamp on it? And I think by tearing apart some of these methods and trying to re-engineer them, I think you get to grips with them like a lot stronger, and figure out, why do some of these workshops and some of these methods exist rather than just sort of like blithely following them. And I think that's again, while it's quite fun, it's always quite scary. We had some incredible clients who trusted us to go out and really kind of dig into their own business by using some of these things, and their trust in us has really helped us figure out what that looks like really, and how we've sort of cobbled together what is probably 50% of a lot of other people's methods and 50% our own craziness. Again, it's great fun. It feels very pioneering, but at the same time, it feels reassuring behind the scenes that it all makes sense, and there's a lot of science in there that's kind of backing it up.
I mean, backing everything up with science is always a great way. I'm a big proponent of that.
Yeah.
And obviously, saying that you're doing lots of business strategy and design strategy reminds me of the other week I was speaking to Sarah Doody for the podcast, which I believe would be the episode a few times before this one. And she was saying that in these portfolios or interviews, when people think about their career, they're really great at saying, oh, look what I can do. I can do all these techniques. And they don't ever explain why. Why did I choose that? What was my intent? So why do you think that so many designers have this Bible of tools like Jobs to be Done and follow it without doing what you've done of ripping it apart?
It's a really interesting question. And I think a lot of it can come down to the time, the opportunity, and the deadlines you have with a client. We've been quite lucky in that we've had some organizations and businesses come to us, and we've partnered with them, and that's the way that 383 has evolved now. We tend to do partnerships with our clients rather than projects, because it works so much better. There's a lot of psychology behind how that works to improve the things that you deliver, but because of those relationships, we've been able to spend more time investigating why these things exist. And I think invariably, it's out of a burning necessity. You can pick up a methodology and you get a great sense that will work for you, but because of what you're trying to produce, that can really hold you to it. You don't really investigate it too much. And I think to a certain extent, a lot of us who are doing this, we come from very different aspects in life. Some of us have learned to be dedicated product designers. Some of us have learned to be designers. Some of us have come via like MBAs or kind of classical strategy route. And there's a lot of that educational background that is very deeply rooted in classical practice. So coming from typography and visual design, that like a lot of the aesthetic approach can pin you down and become very instinctual, especially as a student. I think I was quite lucky in that I studied classical typography before I then went and did a degree in like visual design. It helped me really think about the communication aspect of stuff and question, well, why are we picking this Pantone color? Why is this like really kind of wacky imagery on there? And we're trying to talk to people about something. But a lot of the time, I don't see that happening. There's a lot of a race for that aesthetic dominance. I've been into a number of universities as a mentor and as an employer. And looking around the work, there's some incredible stuff coming out of universities these days that kind of knocks the socks off the stuff that we were doing. But I still struggle to understand the rationale behind things. I can see the methods and the visual effort going into stuff is just mind-blowing. But at the same time, I'm seeing a lot of stuff that is so highly polished. I actually find myself wanting just to see the stuff that someone's scribbled on the back of a tissue or like a fag packet, as we used to say in the advertising world. It's I miss that rationale and that deep-rooted kind of meaning underneath. And I think it's very easy when you're at that level to think about your craft in terms of my physical ability to manipulate things to a high quality. And I think sometimes that can really be the sacrifice at the root idea sometimes.
I can really understand that idea about the craft and moving towards things. One of my favourite sort of pictures for design is Philip Stark's doodle of creating Juicy Salif, the lemon squeezer. Just sort of squids and things. And obviously, he was already a very accomplished designer by that point, so his kind of doodles would make mine look like nothing. So you can really see that. And I hear what you're saying about the intent of what you're doing with typography and illustration. I was speaking to one of our professors the other day about what illustration design have in common. And they're saying that, well, we've got this whole world of human factors, which is a very sciencey world. And we've got this typography and graphic design world. Everyone thinks it's nice, fluffy illustration. You can just make it look nice. And we're going, actually, no. Every time you make something with typography and illustration, it's got a purpose. You're communicating something. That's human factors. So we should be able to make a research agenda of the human factors of illustration. Yeah. Why isn't this there? And why can't we do it?
I know it's, and I think, going back to the sciencey bit of it, the thing I've really enjoyed in the past 5 or 6 years is digging more into the whole thinking fast, thinking slow side of things. And when we really think about that way of illustration and typography having a job to do and how we can use those skills to kind of help people feel something, because that's really what they're there to do. And it's really that system one thinking, that deep rooted heuristic, semi-autonomous way that people operate, that it's so hard to wrap your head around as a designer. And if I had my time again, I probably wouldn't do the visual degree. I'll try and find something to do in neuroscience, because it's so like completely, it's fundamental. The difference it makes. I was chatting to Joe Leach, who wrote Psychology for Designers, about his approach to UX design, and the skills that the typography course taught me, the HND, were fantastic. And I can remember when we started that course being really bored for the first few weeks, because they were just teaching us to manually set letters on a page, and it was all about calculating the character length and the word length and all the rest of it, and we didn't really appreciate why. And one of our first assignments after that exercise was to take a book that existed, but then reset it to affect the speed at which somebody could consume that content. And it was just a plain side of copy with a title, but based upon and one thing we didn't appreciate was that based upon the leading and the character spacing and the typeface that you used and what we call the color density. So like when you squint, how black is that text? How tightly packed is it? Kind of naturally affects people's reading comfort, but that's not something that you do cognitively. So all of these things that your brain is pre-processing for you in the seventh of a second is helping you consume that content. I think illustration and typography, they are doing one and the same thing. They're trying to evoke a sense of something and give you like a feeling of like presence and awareness of the material, like through the skills that are imbued in it. And it's so hard to pair that with the way that people react, with huge bags of hormones and water. And it's really hard to understand how to program something like this when, I don't know, isn't it like 98% of our daily thinking is down to system one or something? I don't know what the exact stat is, but it's staggering how much we're not really consciously thinking about a lot of things that we do, and we're sort of skipping the surface.
And culture comes into that in a massive way. So one of the things I've been really pushing for in my work life is inclusivity. So you start with, right, what's low-hanging fruit I can just do straight away? It's like, right, my email and the documents I give people. Why can't I format that in a way that a broad range of people with great neurodiversity can read simply, clearly? That should be easy. So you go off, you read your papers, your literature reviews, and you find, yeah, it's simple. You have either dark blue or dark grey text in Verdana or Arial, preferably Arial. Make your paragraphs 6 lines maximum. You want to have short areas, sentences about 20 words length-ish. Use simple English rather than complex English, and get to the point. Now, some of those things are a bit more complex to do. Who goes and counts words and sentences? But things like just the typeface you're using.
Yeah.
And I pushed this out, and it's going well. But then I met with a group of dyslexic students very recently, saying, well, why don't you try doing this? Because if you work in this way, you should be able to read your own work better, and that's going to have massive advantages to everything else. And the response was very nude. It's like, well, yeah, but I use the default. Or we've always done it this way. We always use Times New Roman black. That's the right thing to do. And I didn't realize how just cultural baggage, things that we
don't get me started on things like double spaces after a period. We talk about the baggage that kind of comes with the way that we've learned to do things, and it's so hard for us to unlearn those habits. Habits are a great thing in terms of design, and especially in the product world, because they can be incredibly hard to create. We've all heard the analogies of the bollards on the motorway designed to stop you from driving into work, and they're there for like 30 days and all the rest of it. But they're really hard, incredibly hard to deprogram. I think inclusivity and accessibility are two very interesting hot topics at the moment, and they're used interchangeably, but I don't think are the same thing. I was having this discussion with Suki, the 383 founder, a couple of weeks ago, because we're really interested in what we can do with content now. We're trying to grow our business so that content is a part of it, and how we can help our clients consider not just the way that we say things, but what we say as well. And I think there's a lot of accessibility that we overlook and we take for granted. And I think especially when you're younger and you're coming out of being a student, it's not very sexy. But it's so fundamental to the way that people consume information. But then on the other side of things, the thing I see happening at the moment is that people talk about inclusivity, and it's been baked into the idea of what accessibility is, but it's so much broader than that. I was having a conversation on Twitter last night with a few service designers in central government about how it's got much more cultural connotation. So we think about what's been happening in the last few years in terms of our cultural awareness of not very nice things that have gone on inside businesses. We're looking at considerations for much more of a broader cultural remit, LGBTQ, all those different things, how people have very different religious ideals and things that they believe. I think that's where inclusivity comes in, thinking about what you're saying and what you're showing. We did a global piece of work for a large hotel firm a number of years ago, and the platform that we were creating, it was all built upon different APIs and things. So we were pushing content and hotel databases all through different APIs, and there were builders for different parts of the world. So Russia, China, Arab Emirates, all those different areas. And we had to really think about not just the way that people read content, so right to left, left to right, top to bottom, all that kind of thing. It was the sort of imagery that was in there as well in the hotel, and very much the same way that Netflix will surface you different imagery based upon who you are and your profile. These hotel databases, while they're all coming from the same central API, had to surface different imagery based upon the cultural imperatives of that territory. And I think that's something, because while it's still very new at the moment, but doesn't tend to get considered when people talk about inclusivity. But I think it could be a big deal.
Huge. Well, I guess back to what you were saying about you being a neuroscientist if you had to do it all again. And there's so many things which pick up along the way after graduation just through work and slamming your face into it.
Yeah.
So if you just go back, and now I can see you're into your world behind you. You got wonderful posters of Space Shuttle and awesome poster. So obviously design and illustration and typography is a part of who you are. If you were to go back at university and give yourself additional lessons, additional classes that could have helped you get where you are a little bit faster, what do you think they would be?
That's an interesting question, and I think while I can quite blithely say if I had my time again, I'd go and do something about neuroscience or the rest of it. There's a lot of influence from the two big courses that I did. I mean, I think having done a grounding in traditional typography first was super important. And then when I went to study at Salford, and it was very visual. We had guest lectures from Designers Republic and Spin and David Carson and some really interesting, very, very visual designers. And some of that was very alien to the way I'd been taught from a traditional typography sense. But I wouldn't change it for the world because it taught me a lot about visual. You talk about the spectrum behind me. That's a piece of work by Aaron Draplin from the States, and he's a great visual designer. And his iconic approach to design is a huge influence. I think if I could add on learning anything, I think it would very much be about the stuff that I don't think students find sexy, but it's so critical. Research, how to talk to people. I wish somebody had just dragged me off my chair, stood me on my feet, and got me to do public speaking. I really enjoy it, but it's probably taken me until my 40s to really get comfortable with standing in front of a room of more than 3 people and being confident about it. I think that's super, super important. We talked about our children earlier. My son at school, they're doing little bits of public speaking now at the age of 9 and 10. I think that's so important to do. Research, as I've just said, I think is super critical. Knowing how to quickly get into it, not get too lost, but understand how to then begin to map out and qualify and synthesize the stuff that you're looking at, not just throw a load of printouts on the wall and step back and admire the mosaic of mess. But yeah, understanding a little bit about the way that people work. And I really like the work that John Jablonski, who works at Boom Supersonic over in the States, has done to really figure out what a lot of the principles behind user experience design look like, and how to take some of the complex things like Hick's Law and Gestalt, but boil them down to really simple mechanics of how they work. I think is a huge influence and a massive primer that people can really get behind. We don't. I'd quite love to go and do a PhD. I can't afford the time, unfortunately.
Hey, come to life for part time. I'm sure we can find a word for you.
Let's have a chat about that because I am still I think my wife would probably kill me, but I think it still really does interest me. But having accessible information when you're very early on in your career, but knowing how you can gear that up, I think is super important. So yeah, research, big deal. I think understanding some of those less sexy principles behind design. It's not just about the aesthetics, it's understanding why does that aesthetic trigger people or prime a certain reaction, I think is just as important as knowing which Pantone grad and kind of current typeface du jour to pick.
I think what he's saying about is there's 2 worlds in design I see. There's people who come at design from a kind of technical, almost engineering approach. And for them, the research side is, this is really great. Let's get good sample size, run t-tests and all this wonderful stuff. And then go, surely we can mechanicalize all the aesthetics as well. It's like, maybe, but good luck explaining how to make a masterpiece painting. And then you have the people who are just fantastic explosions of creativity that I'm going to call it the softer side, but the aesthetic side comes second nature. And then research is almost like a dirty thing. They don't want to muddy their hands. And there's kind of a challenge of how can you get the 2 sides to cross whilst being comfortable. It's challenging, but it's very rewarding when you manage to make it work.
I think so. And they are almost diametrically opposed in the world of design. But I think under the surface of it, I still come back to things like jobs to be done. Where if you're talking about fusing art and communications, we've really got to understand when we're doing something, why are we doing it? What's the outcome that we're seeking? We're not just thinking about the output of a beautiful piece of design or a beautiful piece of art. We're trying to think about what we're trying to do for someone. And I think, there is a massive grey area between the two when, we can think about how we fuse them together. If something needs to be very much aesthetically focused and people are creating based upon their instincts, I think to a certain degree they probably are utilising a lot of that system one thinking that can be broken down into into science and how they're using their art and their creativity to cater for a certain audience or cater for a certain mood. Or a job to be done. But then when we're moving into something which is much more about helping people do tasks themselves and achieve things, I think that's where the lines start to get blurred, where there's a communication element to it, where we probably need to start being a little bit more practically minded and fusing together that art and science. I think you're right. When it's right and it's done properly, can be incredibly magical. And I see some of the interaction design that's happening at the moment is, especially with the capabilities that we can do and the engineering environments that we've got, and especially with things like virtual reality and augmented reality, and how we can achieve things with those universes. It's fascinating. I'm a massive skeptic of things like AR and VR, but I think, I don't know. Don't get me wrong. I think VR and gaming, it's the whole metaverse thing. I'm massively intrigued about what that can do for therapy and for escapism. And I think there's a big part that can play in people's lives, and it's not to be underestimated. But coming from a communication designer, I struggle to think about how VR can be practically useful compared to AR. I think there's a lot there which we can use, and certainly we're exploring at the moment what that can do for people's journeys, and how it can buy time and provide interest and education in different areas. And I certainly see the work that AR is being used in environments like the Smithsonian and art galleries to bring things to life. I last time pre-COVID we weren't traveling, we were at the Rijksmuseum, and the work they're doing there is just incredible in Amsterdam. So there's a blending there. But when I'm thinking some of the work that we're doing, it's hard to think how VR can bleed into it. And I think there's a lot of unknowns there that I'd be quite interested to explore. I'm not such a skeptic that I'm going to rule it out, but I like to play devil's advocate with that kind of technology and think about, rather than just running into it and just doing something for the sake of it, which I think could ruin its future, I'd like to think about actually how useful could it be, and what are those deep kind of root cases that we can think about, like we think about some of the work that's being done with PTSD, with army veterans and things, and how VR can help there, and in education with children and immersion, especially with COVID where people are locked down. How can we take people to different environments and use things like gaming architecture and what Unreal are doing with their rendering engine to bring things to life more? But there's still a gap, I think, between blending that and the world of communication design.
That's a really interesting way of thinking. I'm going to sort of throw my thoughts out here, if that's okay.
Go for it.
One of my PhD students, who's about to take her Viva, so best luck to her, has been working on augmented reality and fashion retail. She started out doing virtual reality and discovered really early on that what people want from virtual reality is very different from what people are actually developing, what they're delivering, and maybe what we're technically able to produce right now. So the expectations are way higher than the reality. And I'm going to throw in my take on this a bit more. My favourite sci-fi film, actually one of my favourite films ever, is Trip to the Moon. So Georges Méliès from 1904.
Oh, that is a classic.
Yeah, ancient film. It's just a beautiful piece of art. But one of the things I love about it is everything is steam and gunpowder and levers, because that was their world. They could not imagine anything, anything electronic. It was all mechanical. Fast forward to the 1970s, you've got 2001: Space Odyssey, another fantastic, beautiful film. Everything is just glowing buttons. And we're going to push buttons, they're going to glow back at us, and that's how we communicate. Okay, we're going to have a little voiceover here, but it's still a big glowing thing. Because that was computers, that was the world. We can't imagine things. Going forward to modern era, Avatar. Really beautiful, amazing film. And they've got piece of glass they're pulling things across and sharing. And that's, to us, looks stunning. And that's all we can imagine. It's going to change. We're going to have something in the next 50 years, which, if we could see now, is going to blow our mind. So VR's got the potential to do all these amazing, blowing mind things. I'm not sure we can currently imagine what those are. And this goes back to what you said about communication. I think the research agenda needs to focus on to how we're communicating, what's the intent, how we're feeling, what's the emotions, away from what can we see. There's a bit of crossover into that. And I kind of think, well, you got these sensory cinemas been going over since 1920s of how to put smell into cinemas. It's never worked. If our 100 years work, I think it's because you got disconnect between you're sitting in a seat, you're looking at a screen, and you're having a smell, but you know you're in a room. It's not immersive enough. Virtual reality, right, now we're fully immersive. This could be one form of communication getting in there. Let's get those bits in there. How can we get haptics in? How can you get a whole range of things work together, give that message rather than just views? Massive tangent for me. I think the longest tangent I've done on this podcast yet. I completely lost my train of thought, which is incredibly embarrassing.
Chris, I know where you're going with this, and I think it's always. I think as a culture and a species, we're held back by the art of the possible, and it's very hard to. And there are very few intelligences out there who can think beyond it and what some really wacky use of it. And I can remember sat in the cinema, having not watched any trailers for The Matrix when it came out, thinking it was one type of film. And when that tipping point came, when they lifted the curtain, I was like, good grief, this is incredible. And I think it is really hard to imagine, the uses for technology beyond how we are constrained by them at the moment. And the constraints for VR, the fact you've got this dirty, great, heavy bucket on your head. And, we talk about, sensory illusion, and we're a multifaceted species where we've got like nerve endings and all these different senses going on. Even thinking about perception of time, smell, taste, air temperature, and it's very hard to cohesively simulate all of these things and provide like an actual true immersion at the moment. I think it's going to take something like what Elon Musk is doing with his brain implant, where you could potentially overwrite like ganglia or whatever in the brain to inject that sense of immersion, because simulating it, and we've all either read or watched Ready Player One with the haptic suits and all the rest of it, you're still constrained by the fact that you're wearing a thing, and that can be quite that can break the fourth wall, I think, really easily for a lot of people. And if you're a very sensitive person, you're very aware of the clothes that you're wearing and the fact you've got this dirty grey plastic headset on. I think that is the barrier, I think, to this technology being realised much more. But I think it's massively exciting. I say I'm a skeptic. I'm excited by sci-fi and all the rest of it, and what we can do with technology. And I'm all for our robot overlords coming and making our lives easier and everything like that, and true immersion. But I think until we can find it, I think a need will push us past the technological barriers that we have. And I think interesting people like Elon Musk will always be talking about like radical things and putting chips in your brain and the rest of it. But until we talk about those sorts of things, we're never really going to push those sorts of boundaries. But yeah, I think there's a huge difference between AR and VR. I think AR is very much only bound by the thing in your hand, and we've seen Google Glass take off and then not do so much, and they're talking about it again at the moment about what Apple are putting patents out there about what could be the next version of that. And there's still you're very much wedded into the fact that it isn't about immersion at that point. And I think that human psyche and the fact that you accept that, I think, makes AR really, really practical. Where VR is concerned, we really want it, I think, to be plugging into a whole different universe and everything that comes with it. it can't provide that at the moment. So we're still sort of dipping our toe, I think, into those sort of constrictive views of what VR can provide.
I think with digital design and digital products, I feel they work best when the computer disappears and you're left with just a natural feel. So I can see behind you. So I'm just talking about your house all the time. It's just really beautiful. I see you've got guitars and I believe a small modelling amplifier behind you.
Yes. Well spotted.
Yeah, so I play guitar too, and anyone listening plays guitar. I've got a Line 6 Podgo, which is their...
Oh my goodness, classic.
Wonderful thing. And that's their newest modelling amplifier. So anyone who doesn't play guitar, you can just dial in the sound of the amp cabinets of effects from in the 1950s. It's a warehouse, and now it's all in the box. And the only reason why it's quite good now is because it sounds pretty much like the real thing. When you think, well, hang on, we've got all this power in this box. We could do so much, but we're chasing after bits of wood and paper from the 50s. And the guitar itself hasn't evolved since the 50s. It's still a bit of wood, very basic bits of wire, because that's the thing you're feeling. And every time a manufacturer or design company tries to reinvent the amp, reinvent the guitar, reinvent bits and put electronics and lights and bits on, guitarists go, this doesn't feel right, and rejects it for the 1950s stuff.
Yeah, I love the fact that you brought this up. You've introduced a tangent now, and I'm going to go on one. So I'm a huge passionate about guitar. I don't practice it anywhere as much as I should, and I'll show you what one of my distractions is in a second. I think the community is so passionate about traditional things and how digital is not a replacement. And you look at the work that Line 6 have done with Helix. And I know there's a guitarist called Rabea Massad, who's he's done some incredible work, and he's been on tour with a band called Frog Leap, where they basically just do like rock versions of lots of different songs and stuff. But the challenge is for him as a musician, he's got to go from lots of different sounds on stage at the tap of a foot switch, and there's only so much of a range you can get within one unit piece. So like what Line 6 have done with this guitar is invented this thing where it's almost a complete hybrid model, and it's purely digital. You look at the work that you've got with Kempers and things, all these modeling amps, and that's like a really cheap version. That's the Positive Grid Spark, which does really well. Positive Grid with their software have spent a lot of time modeling traditional valve amps to understand how that they sound and emulate that. And I think change is really hard to accept when you've got people who are so passionate about their gear. And I get it. I've played on big valve amps and 2x12s and stuff, and you're pushing a lot of air. And the thing you can't replace unless you've got a gigantic speaker is that pushing of air. You make a sound, and all of a sudden you don't just hear it, you feel it. And that's incredible, and that's hard to emulate. But I do see in the community there's a lot of reticence to accept, oh no, it's not the same. I've got these, germanium valves, and and I've weathered them in. If you bought new versions of these, it wouldn't sound the same and all the rest of it. But come on, guys, we're all just trying to make music and make something and try something out. And I think there's in a lot of our race to reject something, I think that probably puts us on the back foot in terms of experimenting with things. So back before COVID happened, so that one there, that guitar, I made that from scratch. Never made it.
Could you describe it, please?
So this, basically it was a wreck. So this is a Gibson Les Paul. Well, it's meant to be a Gibson Les Paul. So I bought a wreck of an Epiphone guitar off my brother. And I had this theory, and whenever you go amongst all the music community, there's a lot of people that talk about tone wood and how certain things make a certain difference. And you hear people twiddling a knob by 1 degree and think, oh, it makes a significant difference. And I wanted to test this a little bit. And I spent a lot of time listening to luthiers and how they craft their instruments and what goes in. I thought, I'll give it a go. I've never done it before. My brother had this wreck of a guitar that he'd never played, so I bought it off him. And I thought, well, I've always been a big fan of Gibson Les Pauls, but they're really expensive and they're also really heavy. So I thought, can I, using a bit of simple craft and getting the right bits together, make a guitar that is a fraction of the price, a fraction of the weight, that somebody who's never done it before can piece together, just using the right components. And again, there's a tangent here with design. It's getting the right pieces together and fitting them into like a single piece of creation in the right way. So that's kept me sane through lockdown, putting that together. It's been a voyage of discovery where using the right digital mechanics inside, so the wiring, it's all the push-pull pots, so it's got phasing and it's got coil splitting, and I bought the pickups from my old guitar teacher, and I remodeled the headstock to look like a proper Gibson one, just using little chips of wood from here and there, and gradually building up this thing that I think challenges the sound. I mean, people are going to shoot me down in flames in the music community, quite frankly, but I think challenges something that is 4 times the price and twice the weight, but has been a real experiment. And I think there's a thing in design sometimes, I think, where we can follow, going back to one of your early points, we can follow the methods that have been laid out for us de facto, and it will be fine, and we'll get great results and we'll get great outcomes. But I think sometimes you've got to tread the untrodden path to figure out if there's a solution there, if there's a method there. I mean, so many times this guitar could have just ended up trashed and in the bin because I failed. But if we don't set ourselves up to fail and to learn from stuff, we're never going to get anywhere. We're never going to figure out VR and how VR can help us. If Elon Musk doesn't try sticking chips in the brains of mice and chimpanzees and seeing if we can create this human computer interface like that way, we're never going to progress. And it's the same with a lot of things: methodology, musical instruments, VR. It's got tries to fail.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic point. And I'm going to go back to the thing you said about really earlier start about sort of the craft and skills of design, in that working out what you're doing and why you're doing, and all that's so important, as well as having creativity. Because that reminds me of, I've done a really similar project to you. I've got an Epiphone Les Paul from my uni days. I've never liked it. And I can't tell you why. I know what it feels like. It doesn't feel good. And it's very hard to describe. So went out and bought a Fender Jazzmaster, and I love it. Really love it. And I thought, right, I'm gonna make this amazing. I'm gonna make this Les Paul as good as the Jazzmaster. Different guitars, okay, but they can be good in equal ways. I've got it as far as I can get it, and there's something in the sound which doesn't work, and I can't tell you what it is. And the only explanation I've got is there's something in the craft of how this is made and put together which one resonates with me and the other doesn't. And it's something about being human. Maybe it's the way it's vibrating, or maybe it's the way the notes trail off. I don't know. But I've tried being mechanical. I'm trying being very, let's do it. And maybe the right approach is being more creative, spontaneous. Anyway, we're talking about guitars, and this is a design podcast. Let's get back on to...
the metaphors we've got here are incredible, because I'm a big advocate for little things making a big difference. And I think, there are just more experiments to be had with all the things that we do. So, you talk about your guitar not feeling right or not sounding right. It could come down to something so mindlessly simple like the nut or the tuning pegs or just something, right? And it could be microscopic, but it's like you've lost your keys, and until you've opened all the boxes and demolished your room to find it, it's just how much, I guess it's that MVP of how far does the experiment go before we call it and we prove it. And understanding of effort versus outcome, I think is really important, especially, in design. I think we have to try things out, but we've also got to be very clear about how far we can take things and at what point do we stop, and then, test it or move on to the next thing. So yeah, I could talk about guitars to the end of the universe, and I'm quite happy to have found like a logical metaphor between that and the design world. But yeah, and I think as humans, there's a lot we still don't understand about the way that we think, react, and feel. It's not like we can go through lines of code and look to where something is broken and has stopped working all of a sudden. There's a lot in our psychology that it's very hard to dig into, but the right things look and feel. But there's got to come a point where we're digging too deep and we've just got to go, look, it's just not working. Let's think about what the next iteration might be instead.
And saying about next iterations, in the run up to this podcast, we were talking about what you're working on next. You're developing a service. Can you talk about what work is on the horizon for you?
So it's interesting stuff. So I can't name too much. This is the annoying thing. The one annoying thing about 383 is that we work with some incredible clients. A lot of the stuff that we're doing is so early days and we can't actually talk about it. But we're looking at a number of different things that we can produce for our clients. We're doing some service design for an automotive manufacturer that we work with an incredible openness, where we've been really surprised and we really welcomed the attitude of this business, who you would, on the face of it, imagine just want to sell more cars to people, but their approach to being customer focused and genuinely changing the way that people interact with them as a business has been brilliant. It's been fascinating. It's been really refreshing. So we're continuing to do some work with those guys and look at on the service design as well as the product design. What else are we doing at the moment? That's coming up, and look, a number of very similar projects. I mean, we have this thing called the scale of certainty, where we've really unhooked ourselves from being sector specific and project specific, really, where we just talk about people's problems. We go into any kind of business and that business might have a really sure idea of what they want to do. And that's great. We can do that. We can help them engineer it and bring it to life and look at that product life cycle. They might come to us and they'll be aware of they've got a problem. They just don't know how to go about it and how to fix it. And wherever they sit on that scale of certainty, we'll have something that we can do to figure out how to take them to the next step, whether it's going into a design sprint really quickly just to test a range of ideas, or to do a dedicated bit of journey mapping or service research, really, or even just providing design support. We've seconded a number of people into different organizations just to bed in and help them work on their business as usual and then push that boat out to water. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff happening at the moment. It's really varied. I think one of the vagaries of 383 is that no one day is the same. So you're always kept on your toes. I've got people in my design team who are working purely as service designers. Some of them who are working on startups within startups, looking at new products and services and profiling those ready to launch on the Apple Store to test with an audience. I've got another designer who's about to go and second into a big business to help their design team kind of manage their brand and understand how it can then best influence a lot of different channels like digital and brand. So it's fascinating stuff. I think I'd struggle to work anywhere else. I think I've ruined myself being at 383 because it is really varied. But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff happening outside. There's a great design community now, I think, where we are in the Midlands and outside of it. I think the past few years I've been working quite closely with the guys at Birmingham Design Festival, and we've been chatting to the guys up in Manchester and down in London as well to see what we can do. I think long gone are the days where you'd have a big design studio that wouldn't talk to the next big design studio down the road because they were competitors. It's really collaborative, and that's amazing. So I've started talking to a couple of people at various businesses about a new service design community. I think certainly I've been talking to you guys at Loughborough about kind of going in and talking to you, but then kind of putting together just a huge chunk of like-minded people who can talk about things that they might need support on. I think one thing I've certainly learned in my career and doing this job of a head of design is that you don't get a lot of training. Sometimes you've just got to jump into the deep end and figure it out. And I'd quite like to chat to people who've done the same sort of thing to figure out if the things that I've figured out are the same as theirs. So that's really what we want to do with these sorts of communities at the moment is sort of champion the cause. I think there's a lot of call at the moment in big businesses where service design is maybe being overlooked a little bit to bring it back to the fore and understand what it can do and why it's there and build upon those skills and kind of provide more awareness for it. But it's still really early days, but something I'm massively fascinated by.
So why do you think that businesses overlook service design?
I think it's very easy. I don't know. I think there's a lot at the moment of focus on UX and what pure design can do, but it's very much, I think, narrowing the scope of stuff. I think if you look at the hard work that GDS and then ostensibly the team who've moved up to Co-op up in Manchester have done with service design to very much be kind of like the backbone gel between a lot of verticals and a lot of different services. You need a very large scale organization to operate service design effectively. But I see there's been a bit of a shift to low hanging fruit. And I think a lot of teams have become moved into very much a like a siloed focus where it's very much about the UX of a single thing. And then what we've seen happening is how that single thing then operates alongside something very similar in another corner of the business. And there's a lot of duplication happening where there's a process for this thing over here, and there's a process for this thing over there. And they're very, very similar, but the processes are different. And there's a lot of effort going into doing the same thing twice or even three times. And I think service design is there to really go, look, hang on a second, let's get everybody at the same table. What are we all trying to achieve, and how can we make our lives better and more efficient, but much more fluid from a kind of customer experience point of view? Because I think certainly we've seen when we've gone and done our research is if that service design exists and we can tie these two things together that the business might not necessarily think are tied together, it has a dramatic effect on the front end and interaction, and even the back end, the people who operate within the business really. But yeah, I do see a lot of this sort of, especially, in the COVID universe where it's just about trying to be as nimble as possible to stay going. A lot of overlooking that kind of deeper thinking and that sort of richer design behind the scenes.
I find it's amazing that service design isn't bigger because when I was at university, undergrad, coming up to 20 years ago, and I don't remember what the lecturers called it. They didn't use the word service design, but I think it's like business re-engineering. I think that's what they called it. And they're talking about, we've done this project where we went into this company and looked at the process, and they described service design effectively. Maybe not as emotionally, but they did it. And I was there going, oh yeah, that makes complete sense. I bet everyone does this. And then you get out and go, how wrong I was. What? I don't know. It's crazy.
It is really surprising, and I think classically those sorts of approach and methodologies have been the province of the MBAs and the business degrees and all those like really grand strategy pieces. And I've found even from looking at UX and lean UX, how surprisingly simplified it can be. It's not right. It really isn't rocket science. Some days I've sat there thinking about the processes that we use to uncover people's problems and challenges and the jobs they're trying to get done. Thinking, oh my God, this is really simple. Why aren't more people doing it? And service design is, I think, it's an extension of that. I don't know whether we've built up this idea that it's something really big and something really hard, and only the John Harvey Joneses of the world and the change managers can really go and do it. But ultimately, it's just a cake with more layers. Another tangent of mine is going to be food, I'll warn you. But it's just the process is really simple. And it's really, really easy to understand. There's just more to it. And it is really surprising when you dig into it how it isn't more prevalent. And I think sometimes it comes down to willingness and that understanding or the lack of understanding of how accessible it might be, but just that quite often people are only trying to solve problems when they're really on fire and that need is greatest, and then it's the path of least resistance, right? Let's get to the solution as quickly as possible, and then we'll come back to how we might envisage service design later, but then it always gets overlooked, right? It's like that classic web design of old where, we'll release one, we'll fix the fonts and we'll change the layout and release two. You never get to release two. We're on to the next project. It never happens. I think it comes down to those sorts of best of intentions, but invariably the thing that's most on fire will get looked at.
Oh yeah, this reminds me of what I was talking to someone the other day about. Is someone's asking me about user research, and they're saying, well, you're teaching all these things and you're working these kinds of things, and this is the way that you're doing user research, but isn't that just academia? Because in the real world, we do things differently. And going, well, yes and no. Could go back to Don Norman back in 84, so as old as I am. He was saying that when a project launches, it's behind schedule and above budget. So user research, the first thing to be cut. Don't worry, we'll do it next time. But of course, next time project starts, you're behind schedule and above budget. So we'll do it next time. And next time never comes.
Yeah, you're kicking the can down the road. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe it's something back into neuroscience and psychology, which maybe if we stop trying to appeal to people's rational behavior and trying to do something else, we can force change, but it's complex.
I think you've got to, it's rare, and it's having the affordance to give yourself a break, because if you're constantly in that cadence and that rhythm, you're never giving yourself the opportunity to stop for a minute and think about, actually, how do we do this differently? Huge fan. I'm glad you brought up that example there. Nielsen Norman and the work they're doing. It's just incredible. We're big fans of the way that they've introduced lean research. And it's certainly helped us qualify an approach with some of our customers where, it's like tax doesn't have to be taxing. User research doesn't have to be ridiculously expensive and take forever. And there's a lot to be learned from those guys. But I think you've got to give yourself the opportunity to stop, even just for 2 minutes, and think about, the next time we do this, how are we going to change the way that we scope it? Because the second that you're into that scoping, you're operating on heuristics and you're doing it the same way that you've done before. You're only going to get the same problems before. You've got to fix the leak before you wash your next batch of clothes. All about the metaphors. I think that's super important.
I'm glad you brought that up, because it reminds me of Nielsen Norman. How many people do you need for user testing? Everyone goes, 5. But what? Why 5? Everyone goes, because it's 5. Yeah, but what does the article say about this? And they go, no, it's quiet. So I went and had a look at this a while ago when I was working on my book, Sample Size for Design Research. And they, in one of their posts, they actually give the equation they work out of 5. I went, that's really interesting. Now, they've assumed that one person can detect this many usability problems. No one can get everything, so you need to multiply it up, and through the equation, you get 5. So, right, that's interesting. But they're working on websites from the 2000s. And this is a very different world we're in now. We've got complex ones, simple things, and very complex sites. So I did some other research. The more complex a website becomes, the less one person can detect. So you get different values for the equation. So I recalculated everything. And it turns out that when Norman Nielsen is saying you need 5 people, actually you need 7 to get the same result on a more complex website. And this goes up to 11 people. And of course, it doesn't actually matter about that 5 and 7, because it's about what you care about that time. Initial lo-fi prototype, how many usability problems do you care about? Not that many. Just give me the top 50% and I'm happy. Right, small sample size. You're about to launch the new version of Windows. how many problems do you want? Well, none. Right. How many people do you need to work out how many problems are going to be on Windows? And you actually work this whole multiplicity. And for some reason, the UX design world has just abandoned all this thought and gone, no, the gospel says 5, the answer is 5.
I find it remarkable in this day and age, and especially through COVID, the suspension of common sense in terms of I think there's a validity and truth to the rule of 5, and there's a time and a place for it. So when we're doing light touch qualitative research, we look at segments and we boil it down using that method. But then very quickly, you need to know when you demarcate from that, and you adapt and you grow. I'd like to think that if Microsoft were releasing a version of Windows, they weren't just going to test it with 5 people, because that's right. I mean, they probably have, looking at Windows, quite honestly. Sorry, don't shoot me, Bill. But I think we've got to question. It's something we don't do, something people don't do a lot. You talk about, what would you do differently when you're a student? I think challenge more, challenge the brief. Don't just follow the instructions. It's not an ethics kit. Challenge more. So, think about that methodology. And I think it's incredibly useful. But I think we've spent a lot of time looking at the research and the work that those guys have done and understanding where it fits within the business. But then there's also a point where, you're putting more risk and more reliance on things, and you've got to find bigger problems and really make sure something is watertight. It's got to be an exponential increase from there. But I think you've got to challenge, use your common sense as a designer, and just think, oh yeah, I'm going to put this product out onto the Apple Store. I've only tested it with 5 people. Or we've got 3 segments, so we've tested it with 15 people. It's not a thing.
Okay, it's been an absolute pleasure listening to all your thoughts. I think what you're saying there comes to a really nice end to where we're going. I'm sure we could go off in many, many tangents about baking and life, Chris, and guitars. It's those things go together really clearly. Baking and guitars, natural.
This chat now, I feel justified in my rants.
It's been really fantastic hearing all your thoughts, and I would love to probe you more on what 383 is doing and who they're doing it with, but I'm sure confidentiality is there. We'll have to look at your website and see what comes out in the near future. So I would always love to end with the same question for everyone, because it's the most telling way about someone's world vision. So, Karl Randay, what do you feel makes the world a better place?
I think it's, oh my goodness, that's a really good question. That's probably put me on the spot. I think it's, I guess, human nature and the way that we can surprise ourselves by, when push comes to shove, how we can be there, how we can make an effort, how, again, the little things make a big difference. The simplest of gestures will, save someone's life potentially. And I think I'm never not surprised by, how much of an effect that has. I mean, in design as well, but generally, we've just come out of a pretty bad 2 years, right? But we've all got through it, not because of the grand gestures, but because of some of the little things, really. I think it's fascinating to look at. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really a great way to see the world. So, Karl, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Indeed. Thanks very much for having me on, Chris.
Thank you once again to Karl for joining us on the podcast. It's fantastic listening to you and having a discussion about things that we are so passionate about. Now, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe and leave a comment on iTunes. It really helps get the message out there to build this community. So, I hope you have a great day. I've been Dr. Chris Parker. I'll see you soon.